Coming up on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE with an in-depth analysis of how it impacts your school community. Plus, we're talking about masking today, the work in one Northern California school district to put some rules and regulations in for masking and what could happen to the state coming up next week.
The Legislative Lunch Break starts now.
Couple of minutes after 1 o'clock, we welcome you on a Wednesday to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with Edgar Zazwata, ACSA Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. I'm Naj and Edgar, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Welcome. We're honored to have you here. Go ahead and jump onto our chat, say hello. Let us know where you're watching from today. Edgar, Ellen Wheeler, Susan Denton, Gary Reller, Philip and Marie already in the chat this morning. How are you today?
I'm good. 2 weeks in a row. You didn't approve another week off, so we're back at this, and in many ways, I feel like there's a lot of deja vu here over the last number of years.
Yeah,
because I feel like not an hour has gone by this week without talking about face masks, which is kind of like at the start of the pandemic where we were having conversations. So I know we're gonna get into it, but it's been a lot out in the air. I know a lot of issues facing our folks, but looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, we're going to be focusing a lot on masking, about the changes across the country, the changes that are going to be taking place here in California, and what may happen for schools. We're going to talk with Dave Klein, who's the superintendent over at Oakdale Joint Unified School District, a little bit later on in the show. He released a letter out to his school community, kind of outlining what is going to be taking place, what has been taking place all along, and what those that do not support masking can do from this point forward. We're going to go ahead and address that topic coming up a little bit later on in the show. Edgar, want to just jump to a couple of news items as we move forward. We talked about masking. We talked about some of the changes that are happening here in the state. The latest here, vaccinated Californians can, according to the Sacramento Bee, get rid of their masks indoors soon. That announcement that came out from the State Department of Public Health on Monday. The state's mask requirement for vaccinated people in most indoor settings will lift on February 16th. Let me just ask this. That's the information that has come out. We could anticipate some news perhaps involving masking and California public schools. What are you hearing at this point?
Yeah, so I know this is probably the reason we're getting a lot of questions, is because the governor earlier this week got ahead of the deadline. So just to provide context, the February 15th is when the state indoor mask mandate that was really put in place because of the Omicron surge expires, and the governor and the administration went out and said that they're not going to renew it. They're going to let it expire. And so then it begs the question, what happens with schools? And as we stand now, the governor has made it clear that next week there is no, as of today, and I'm going to say this is going to be my caveat a lot today because there's a lot of moving pieces. We don't anticipate that anything's going to change for schools next week. Even though the indoor mask mandate for counties or anything outside of schools, and there's some other sectors that still have to wear face masks, regardless of the statewide order, schools being one of them, that's still going to remain in place. What the governor has alluded to, the other piece of the puzzle here, is that next week they will have something to say about schools, that they will have something to report. So we'll get into that. We could talk more at length about what do we think that means with our analysis, what we know, what we don't know. But I think the underlying piece here is that there's a lot changing across the country. Like by the day, the states that have announced that not only they're removing their mask mandates for the general population, but specifically for schools, seems to be growing. And even the demographics of some of those states, I think, is noteworthy as well.
I had a discussion with a Central Valley superintendent a little bit earlier this morning, and this just kind of adds maybe to the clarity and the challenges for school administrators. But his comment was, look, if there are changes to what happens with masking in the general public, but not in the schools, how is that going to create more confusion? And how is that going to create more challenges for school administrators, both at the district office and at school sites? Because now they're suddenly forced to enforce guidance, enforce regulations that is not happening out in the general public. So it's another challenge for them, which just adds to that list, Edgar, of the number of challenges that they're having to confront and having to be fluid through this whole masking and then the COVID-19 guidelines.
Yeah, and to make matters even a little bit more complex, so you have on one end, you have the statewide masking requirement. You could have your local orders. So if your county, and this is going to be the case, LA being probably the most noteworthy, the public health officer has already stated that despite the statewide masking requirement going away, masks are still going to be required in the county. And then they touched on schools and saying that the first step that they'll go is to not require masks outside in schools, assuming at some point that there is not a requirement from the state level, right? So this is where you get this complicated. Another added wrinkle is that Cal OSHA will have to modify the rules as it relates to employees. Mm-hmm. Because the emergency standards that right now technically are in place till the end of March still say that employees have to be masked. And this was a change that happened in terms of the emergency standard. At some point, there was a distinction between whether you were vaccinated, not vaccinated. Those aren't the current rules right now. So those would already have to be modified. I'm gonna go on a limb, and sometimes I'm sheepish about making predictions or whatnot because we're on record and we're this gets recorded, and so it's easy for somebody to say, "Look, Edgar said this and it was wrong." But I will venture to say that next week, I don't know that it'll be as far as saying that they will next week. That I don't believe that the mask requirement is going to go away. Now, what we're going to be looking out for is the governor has a couple of options. He could either do what some is happening in some other states, in New Jersey, Oregon, Connecticut, to say, we're going to take away the mask requirement, let's say March, and I'm going to make up a date, in March. Or the other alternative, they may take the approach of, we'll evaluate it again in March, right? Which I know is not going to make some people happy, or they could set whatever their criteria is going to be. So I think that's the piece that we're going to be looking at. I will say, and this changed, at some point, if you had asked me a month ago, do we believe that the mask mandate will be required from a state level for the rest of the year? I would have said, yeah, given where we were at, I would have said that there's a good chance. Now, I think the tide has turned. I think the state is looking for what is the exit strategy. So if you ask me today, no, I don't think that necessarily the mask mandate will be in place for the remainder of the school year.
Well, it's funny that you brought that up, Edgar, about the reevaluation in the spring, because we know that in New York, in the state of New York, they announced an end of the indoor masking mandate. However, the masking mandate remains in place in schools. Other states have gotten rid of them completely, but it still remains in schools, and they'll reevaluate in March. So, that adds to the discussion. And I would bring in, I know that our team just put up Marie Russell's comment about concerned may change school guidance for students, but not change for staff with Cal OSHA. So clearly addressing what you just mentioned. And then Lisa Lamb put in here, we have a growing number of students protesting masking and families denying independent study. How are others managing this? You know what? We're going to go ahead and address that with the superintendent from Oakdale Joint Unified just a couple of minutes away. Do want to bring up two more things for you. And I would suggest for those of you who have the opportunity to go and take a look at this survey that is published by the National Education Association. And I know, Edgar, we've talked about this, so these numbers are not going to be a surprise. According to an NEA survey, 55% of educators are thinking about leaving the profession earlier than they had planned. That is up from 37% in August. And this one is perhaps most startling. And Edgar, I'll have you maybe just mention this. The poll found that a disproportionate percentage of Black, 62%, and Hispanic Latino, 59% educators already represented in the underrepresented in the teaching profession were looking towards the exits. I bring that up because you and I, when we were down in Southern California for Superintendent Symposium 2 weeks ago, we spoke with the new LA Unified Superintendent, and he talked about representation and how important it is for some students to be able to see people that look like them at their schools in leadership positions, whether it's a teacher or an administrator, superintendent. Listening to some of these numbers, Edgar, it's not something that we haven't heard of before, but it is still alarming, especially in some of the underrepresented communities.
Oh yeah, the numbers are concerning. I mean, this has been very much on our radar because even when we get past the surge, when we, it looks like we're well on our way there, I think we're going to have to take stock about, okay, what's kind of where are we at as a profession? Where are we at in terms of what have our employees and our school leaders been through the last number of years, our educators, our teachers, right? And I think this is where some folks have even said, even though it's going to get better, it doesn't take away the cumulative effect of what's transpired over the last 2 years. And I think with that said, to your point, the empirical data makes this very clear that the diversity matters for a number of reasons. Whether your teacher is a person of color, whether your school site leader is, that the data validates that is important in underrepresented communities. So this is going to be a bigger issue on the human capital side that we're going to have to continue to keep our eye out on.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, let's go ahead and let's bring the masking back in. I have this letter that came out from the Oakdale Joint Unified School District earlier this week, that beginning Monday, which was 2 days ago, students in the district who refuse to wear a mask will not be allowed inside classrooms starting this week at both the junior high and high school. No alternative settings will be provided, and no work will be given to those who continue to protest. Let's go ahead and bring in David Klein. He's the superintendent from the Oakdale Joint Unified School District. David, it is an honor to have you here on the show with us today. Well, let me just read a couple of quotes that are in this letter that was sent out to your school community, and then we'll dive into this. Quote, students who wish to protest the mask mandate are asked to enroll in our district's independent study program, and we also suggest that further protests are directed to Sacramento. A second quote, Oakland Joint Unified is legally bound to uphold the mandate. We have an obligation to provide a safe environment for our students and our staff. Under the operative executive orders and provisions of the California Health and Safety Code, schools must comply with orders and guidance issued by the California Department of Public Health and relevant local health departments to limit the spread of COVID-19 and protect public health. That is right from the letter. So let me just ask you to describe what's been happening in your school community and what drove you to deliver this message to students, parents in your school community.
Well, first of all, thank you, Edgar and Naj, and good to see people from Region 7. What really happened, it was stemmed from last week. We heard that there was going to be some protests going on. We wanted to honor that. We thought it was important if kids wanted to protest that we provide an avenue for them to do so. At the elementary level, I think it went okay, still continues to go okay. They are missing out on instruction. At the 7-12 level, I genuinely think that there were students who wanted to protest and they wanted to do their work in an alternative setting without a mask on. But it really came to light when other students were not there to work. I think they were there to be with their friends or be disruptive. There were several students who left the high school campus without permission to come protest down at the district office. And then later on in the afternoon, there were a parent that became overly aggressive, threatening with violence to our site administration, and that can't take place. And so we decided to make a change. I met with cabinet over Saturday and Sunday, and we created a letter to go out. We communicated that out to our families and to our administration. and say that we're not going to have this anymore. We need to focus on the 5,000 other students and their families and work on providing them with a top shelf education.
Hey, Dave, thanks for joining us, and thanks. Hopefully, you're getting this a little bit more these days. But just thank you for your work, right? And we were joking before you came on that about your newfound celebrity, right? You've been in the local news. We've seen you all over. The story got picked up around the state. I know it wasn't what you signed up for, but you're doing your best, to manage a complicated situation. One of the pieces, kind of in the spirit of what we're talking about today, the health rules have continued to modify, right? Since the start of the pandemic, they're ever changing. You've been on the receiving end, but also on the implementation end. Also, not to mention that when folks, as you indicated, when folks are upset, they're not necessarily going to the state. They're getting angry at you. So how have you dealt with that? How have you managed, and how has it changed the job as a school site leader or a district leader, for your team?
Right. Well, I do want to mention the members of I'm going to say this again, forgive me, but the members of my cabinet are just absolutely dynamite. They're extremely experienced as administrators, and they're very knowledgeable with Oakdale Joint Unified. So they have a history here, and they have a good feel for what's going on in the community, and tremendous knowledge in their area. So I did, as we put this plan together, I did lean on them tremendously to give me input about what's going to be the best way to make some changes to provide education to our students. Naj, I think you mentioned, and in terms of how things change and how that's affected us, we communicate with County Public Health in terms of information that goes out. We have our health team when it's something that's related to testing, that we communicate out through our health team. We communicate with our community pretty well, and our teachers pretty well, and our bargaining units. And so as long as we keep those channels of communication open, it's not going to be easy because there's some people, some different views, but we are pushing the information out. We are available to respond to questions, concerns. And so we just do the best we can. And once again, my cabinet, my executive assistant is tremendous.
And want to remind you that if you have questions or comments, go ahead and dump those into the chat, and we'll get to those a little bit later on. Dave, you heard Edgar talk about changes to the masking guidelines. We could have changes that come from the governor's office related to California public schools, maybe as early as next week. Do you get a sense that the announcement will cause more confusion no matter what is announced, not just, at the school sites, but parents and guardians and students and just stakeholders in general?
Oh, absolutely. I'm getting emails from concerned parents, other districts that are making some changes or perceived changes anyway in anticipation of the mandate after February 15th. And so, yeah, I think there's going to be some confusion, but it really does depend on the message. And Naj, you talked about, if there was a very specific announcement, we will review guidelines in school at a specific date. And these are some of the criteria that we're going to look at in order to make those changes. If we had something like that, I think that would be a huge step forward, because then we can communicate that out. Right now, parents are thinking February 15th, no more masking. We have to then communicate that out no, that doesn't apply to TK-12 schools. But if we had something that it doesn't apply to TK-12 schools. However, on March 1st, if these criteria are met, we will have masking be optional at that point. I think that's something that we could communicate out. We could with all of our parents, and I think that would help calm some concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Dave, I'm going to touch on a question we got from Lisa Lamb in terms of one of the nice things about this dialogue we've had on a weekly basis is folks kind of sharing their experience. So since we have you on the line, kind of get your perspective, because this is at the heart of what you've been dealing with. She asked that they have a number of students, protesting masking, and you describe how they were, and that they're denying independent study. So maybe if you could touch on the independent study piece about how you guys have dealt with that. But also, I was going to ask, just more generally speaking, there's been you're in many ways representing what's been going on in the field in a lot of different communities, right? And I think the longer this goes, this is actually amping up in some new places. So just general advice that you would have now for some of your colleagues around the state, given that you've confronted this over the last, number of weeks, but months in essence.
Yeah, I was immersed for about 3 days in this. Our sites were the ones that really learned a lot about it. I think one thing that we learned, as I said, there were some kids that really did want to protest, but then we had other kids. You know what? I have a test in science. I'm going to protest. Or my friend is in there right now. I'm going to go protest. And so what we did is we gave very specific guidelines. If you're going to protest, well, and this is now at the elementary level, because at the 7-12 level we've moved on. But at the TK6 level, it's, if you're going to protest, so be it. You can protest, but if you're having some sort of an assignment or a fun activity or something like that, you could very well miss out on that, because there are consequences to protesting. I think it's important if you want to protest, but by the same token, there are consequences. So make your decision. You want to protest, we'll provide an area for you right now. And then, but in terms of, we called it selective protesting, going back and forth. Well, make a decision on what you want to do. And for the time being, we'll provide an area for you. But in terms of going back and forth and only coming out for not protesting when it's a fun activity, that's not really what we're calling a protest. Did I answer your question, Naj?
Yeah, Dave, the one piece I would add, no, and that I think that you did a nice job of summarizing that. What's been the general practice, or what's been the reaction in terms? I know the state, the tool that they gave you was, okay, offer independent study for kids that don't want to go in the classroom. Like, in practice, how has that played out in your community?
To be honest with you, Naj, I think it's been relatively easy. We have an online process to enroll in the independent study program. The concern that we get, and we just communicate this out, if it becomes, I think right after Thanksgiving, we put a halt to that, because it was difficult for a student to transition from in-school learning to independent study learning with only 2 weeks left in school before finals. And so we just had to establish some parameters. But in terms of the process, sign up for independent study, it's been okay. Early on, there were some concerns in terms of staffing. I think some districts in our state are dealing with that. But I think we've been able to address those staffing issues and been able to provide an independent study environment for the students who want to do independent study.
And Dave, I would make note of a couple of comments. I've seen this throughout our show here. Lester Powell, which we put up there, saying, "I love this courageous leadership," and Carol Boyd saying, "You're an inspiration and know that you're doing what is right. Hang in there." I want to just pull a quote here again from your letter to families. Quote, "On Friday, a father directly threatened both male and female staff members with such fury that we are working with Oakdale Police regarding this matter. Students are being regularly bullied for wearing masks by both fellow students and others. People have made it clear over social media, email, and in person that their verbal threats will become physical if they don't get their way." Okay, so you've laid it out. Look, if you want to protest. Go take it to the state. We're just enforcing the rules over here. So I would ask, we're sitting in February. There's a few months left in this academic year. What gives you hope as we move through the spring and into the end of the academic year? Are changes at the state level going to be positive for the school districts? Or do you still foresee, no matter what the state decides, you're still going to have to deal with so many things in the public that force you to have to put letters out like this?
Right. Well, to those people who are being complimentary, I thank you. But I am going to pass that on to our site administration. They had to deal with that on the front lines, and truly inspirational to me that they did that. They did it so well and so patient. So I'll be sure and pass that on to our site administrators. They were absolutely tremendous. I am concerned about what the future is going to bring. If it's the same of there's no more masking in public places, but that doesn't apply to public education. So we have to deal with that. And there's no communication in terms of a date in the future. So parents are going to be back to, when is this going to end? That's what we're hearing. It has been going on for 2 years. When is this going to end? And and I know that they're going to bring up other states. They've been doing it all along, and now they have some Democratic states that are making some changes as well. And so and some folks really do think that change can happen at the local level, and we're consistent in our communication. That cannot happen. We are bound by the mandate, and so we're trying our hardest to communicate that out. But it is frustrating. I wish we would have specific points to present to our community that came down from the state.
David Klein, Superintendent, Oakdale Joint Unified School District. David, it's been an honor to have you. Thank you for your work in your school community and in service of your students, and we look forward to talking with you next time.
Thanks so much, gentlemen.
All right, Edgar. So, I mean, a lot to deal with, to confront with that. I do want to just ask you to comment on a couple of questions. We had that question from Angela Shull about Cal OSHA, and then, of course, collective bargaining. Both of those questions came up. What are you hearing? OSHA and collective bargaining.
Yeah, so the Cal OSHA, somebody I think brought up a good place that the changes aren't going to matter much unless there's subsequent changes to the Cal OSHA rules, which will apply to our employees. So in other words, you can remove the mask mandate, but if the rules that apply to employees still say you have to do one or the other, that's going to put folks in a complicated situation. So I think, one, there's going to have to be some consistent changes across the board. So how the state navigates that is one thing. And I would also point out probably some broader changes to CDPH guidance, because removing the school mask mandate in itself without making some broader changes to, let's say, the quarantine recommendations or the quarantine rules, that's going to be challenging. We have the modified quarantine right now that could say you could stay in school if both parties are masked, right? And now we've moved away from that. There's some other options in terms of group testing and whatnot. So there's just a lot of these recommendations that have really been the foundation for a lot of the county rules would also have to change. So Cal OSHA and CDPH, it's not as easy as just changing the mask mandate. And I think on the collective bargaining piece, I think that's a really interesting question. I think on two fronts. One, I think the governor has alluded to this, that while he's talking to school officials, and and one of the things where we're in their ear, making sure that they're getting that perspective from everybody, right? We have a very diverse state, as we see from our viewership here. This conversation is very different depending on what part of the state are you in. So really making sure that they have the sentiment broadly of the different communities in our state is one thing. The governor's also alluded to the fact that he's working with other stakeholders, namely labor, on what's their perspective. I think the perspective of teachers, other school employees, about how they're going to feel if they remove the mask mandate, I think could be something that plays a hand here in some of the decisions moving forward.
And let me just address something. We had Scott Nanick, who's the great county superintendent in Calaveras County. He asked this question specific to Dave, but let me just kind of address this. How is your board held up through this? Ours are getting attacked personally and professionally. Several have resigned. Scott, I spoke with 3 superintendents this morning who spoke specifically about not having the protests at school sites, but they're coming to the board meetings. We see it in the news, Edgar. They're coming to the board meetings, and that's led to some school board members saying, "That's it. I've had enough. I took this job to support students. I didn't take it to be verbally attacked, physically attacked, have protesters show up outside of my home." So, Scott, I can tell you directly from the mouth of 3 superintendents that I spoke with earlier today, they said that exact same thing, which, Edgar, I mean, we talk about changes here in public education. We've heard so many of our district leaders, of our public educators, even what we saw out of that NEA survey about educators who are just saying, look, this pandemic, I've had enough. It's not the first time, we're going to be confronting this. And I do think that we're going to see more change as we go through the end of this academic year.
Yeah, there's some bad stories out there. I mean, another story that got in the news and the press a few weeks ago was up here, one of the local districts in Buckeye, I think a school district out in El Dorado Hills, where folks had, a site administrator had people on their doorstep, protesting. Again, the principal is just trying to follow the rules, yet all the anger, frustration, as somebody pointed out in the chat, like our folks are the ones who are left holding the bag. So I think to the extent, I think some good themes came out here today of the consistency of messaging, whatever the state does, it's how that's going to be communicated, what kind of the domino effect is going to be for our folks here in the next couple of weeks as this comes to fruition. I think will all be important questions.
Yeah, and I just want to point out from Dave Garcia, Region 7, ACSA Board of Directors, he put here in the chat, allowing optional masking in all settings would resolve many, if not all, masking issues. Certainly another discussion point, as one superintendent told me earlier today, the people wearing masks are likely the ones who are already vaccinated. That was the comment there. So probably not incorrect. Hey, let me give a piece of positive news here, because we'd like to give shout outs as much as possible. And Edgar, this makes my job so much easier, which we always like to do. Let me give a shout out to Mr. Botten. I wish I had the first name in my notes here. Saugus High School, William S. Hart School District, William S. Hart Union High School District down in Southern California. This is the final week to get in submissions for the Leadership Magazine, for the May-June edition of Leadership Magazine, Student Voices. Whether he made this an assignment for his students or not, Edgar, I must have gotten 50 submissions from just his students this week.
Nice.
So a big shout out to Mr. Botten over at Saugus High School, William S. Hart Union High School District down in Southern California. You've made my job easy, Edgar, which we know. I like to have an easy job.
Hey, that's great. When they're giving you content delivery, you have a pipeline. You got to keep those. I think you got to give them a little bit more than a shout out there for making your job a lot easier on that end.
I got the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break cup right there. Maybe it's time that we start branching that out. I know that Angela Schell and Gary Reller would like to make sure they have one. Michelle Murphy as well. So I'm
still waiting for my T-shirt. Somebody promised me a T-shirt at some point. I know.
I know. All right, Edgar, good seeing you today, man. Lots of news, and we probably will have more next week as well.
We'll stay on top of it. I'm sure part of it will be clarity, part of it will be more confusion, but one thing we'll guarantee we'll stay on top of all this, and we'll be back next week to share what we know.
Share what we know. Exactly. Thank you, folks, so much for joining us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, live and interactive on Wednesdays. Have a great rest of the week. We'll see you next time.